Okay, great. Thank you so much to Vittorio for hosting us. We will kind of, I think, divide ourselves into three parts. We'll kind of give a historical overview of the Black Panthers because it's not so well known in Italy, we think. So we'll kind of spend the first part kind of talking through some basic historical information. And then maybe we'll see, maybe take a break, maybe we'll see how we're feeling. And then in the second part, Andrew will talk a little bit about the state, and I'll talk a little bit about strategy, which is our more specific research. So we'll start, Andrew will take over in a second and kind of start us with some common criticisms of the Panthers as a way into understanding the history, and then I'll talk through a timeline, and we'll kind of give some contextual information about the situation in the 1960s in the U.S. Because the history sort of, as I said a moment ago, the history is quite complicated, and outside of maybe some recent historians and members who are surviving, it's not very well known. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Andrew. At any point, if you want to stop us and ask questions, we can just take questions as we go. And like I said, we'll kind of stop after the first part. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, thank you all three of you for taking the time to listen to us today and join us. To start by kind of discussing some of the common criticisms of the Panthers that maybe circulate internationally among those who are not already sort of schooled in the particular history or engaged in questions about 1960s and 1970s international solidarity movements. Some of the more common criticisms we want to kind of get rid of quickly so that we could move on to those that might have something more fruitful to offer us. But to start, I just wanted to say that Dave and I are both thinking about the Black Panther Party because it was, a party form of sorts, as what the co-founder of the organization, Huey P. Newton, called a structured political vehicle. So we'll return to questions of what the party form could mean. I've been thinking a lot about this in relation to Mario Tronti's thought. Specifically, he has a phrase that he uses to describe his conception of the party as an organized strategic subjectivity. And I think that this way of thinking could be helpful for all of us as we move through this. And especially because the United States did not, and still does not, have a left, labor, or communist party anywhere near the scale, of course, that you all had in Italy, as well as many other countries in Europe and around the world. Because the U.S. has not had a left formation of that kind of size and scale, we think that the Panthers really do allow us to ask some questions about the problem of organization in terms of organizational form again, scale and longevity of projects, as well as strategy and the party's relationship to the state itself. Okay, so those are just some ways some things I wanted to share with you all to kind of introduce the way we approach the Panthers. But, I teach undergraduates in the United States, and I bring the Panthers in at some point every semester. And so even in the United States, these sort of common criticisms are very prevalent. They remain prevalent. That the Panthers were violent criminals, that they were adventurous who were eager to provoke violent reaction, that they were cultural nationalists, that they believed in some sort of essentialism that black people in America possessed over and above political or class differences within the black community in the United States. The notion that they were racist against white people, which is something that fueled a lot of the repression that came down on the Panthers, especially as Dave will, I think, mention a little bit later, as in the 70s, the FBI develops the COINTELPRO program. And so this sort of recurring claim that the Panthers were these violent thugs is used to justify long prison sentences awaiting even just trials in many cases, or many, many years of solitary confinement for crimes that supposedly occurred. And then a final one that maybe is more specific to the literature in the US, the kind of sociological, historical literature, something that we think is not helpful, that we'd like to dispense with, is this bifurcation of social movements in the US in the 60s between the good 60s and the bad 60s. So I don't know if there, maybe something analogous is here in Italy with some of the historiography, but this notion that in the early 60s there was this kind of hope of change, there was this promise of reform that was led by, if disillusioned, then still very pragmatic, rooted, often liberal activists. And then in the later 60s there was a turn to senseless, needless violence, right, that actually undermined the, whatever chance of reform the earlier moment offered. So these are dichotomies, caricatures that persist sort of in the popular imagination, outside of kind of critical and scholarly circles. And we wanted to just sort of raise them to kind of put them to the side. But we could talk about them a bit more if you all are interested. More interesting for us are a series of criticisms that we think actually open up quite interesting questions about the Panthers, right? Their practice and also some of their theory. One is about the question of the party itself, the hierarchy and organizational form, how members related to one another. This is related to the power amassed by certain individuals in the party to dictate party line, to expel members who they deemed no longer kind of in accordance with it. And this is linked to a second criticism that Robin Spencer, a historian at the City University of New York, has done a great job at exploring, which is the role of women in the party, which is often silenced in most historical records, whereas women were actually the majority members of the party, and especially in the party's community-based programs, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, they played an outsized role. So these are criticisms that we think are potentially fruitful, and scholars have already been doing really good work on them. The last one that I wanted to flag is their relationship to the state. So I'll come back to this, but there is an increasing sort of, I don't want to call it a school, but there's a tendency among, again, sociologists and historians of the new left in the United States and of Black Power movements, and the Panthers in particular, to see them as having a relationship to the U.S. state that was compromising. They talked about the origins of the party in federally funded anti-poverty offices. They talk about the orientation of the party's later programs as being limited by a liberal mindset of services, of delivering services rather than making demands upon the state. And finally, this criticism comes out in an acknowledgement or a study of the party's later turn to elections. In 1972, they begin in earnest running for local seats in Oakland and in Berkeley. So we think that even though some of the way that these criticisms are framed is misplaced, they do open up interesting questions about the relationship of social movements to the state, subjectivation of activists in relation to programs that might attempt to subsume their energies, and also questions of strategy, which Dave will get to. So those are some of the criticisms we wanted to sort of provide to you all in case that they're not part of your lexicon regarding the party. But now I'll pass it back to Dave, who's going to give a sort of timeline of major events in the history of the Black Panther Party to continue to kind of give us this historical backdrop.
Okay, yeah. So I was going to give you... So essentially the party is founded in 1966, in the fall of 1966. And I think there's some debate about this. I think it's 1981. Do you know? 81 or 82, the official life of the party. But there's kind of like broad strokes assessment of, you kind of have like a period like in a lot of context all over the globe in the very late 60s of like an intense struggle which kind of breaks apart in the early 1970s, and specifically where there's a break between Huey Newton, who's one of the co-founders, and Eldridge Cleaver, who was exiled from the Panthers and started the first international chapter in Algeria, where many revolutionaries were at the time. And then, like Andrew was just saying a moment ago, in 1972, the Panthers kind of turned a lot of their attention. At least the Huey Newton, who was in prison but then was released from prison, called back many of the Panthers to Oakland, and it became something close. For the last 10 years or so of its existence, it became kind of a commune-like organization in Oakland, California, which is in the Bay Area of California in the north, which is where the party started. But just to I'm just going to go through a timeline just to give you a sense of some of the big major events. Andrew was mentioning a moment ago the work of Robin Spencer, who's done a lot to kind of call attention to the role of women in the party, and what I'm about to give you is kind of like what you could call sort of like the great black man history of the Panthers in terms of the founders and the leaders, who were mostly men until relatively late. Elaine Brown became the head of the party at one point in, I think, 1974. But just to give you a sense of the kind of intensity of events and kind of some broad schematics, but like Andrew said, a majority of the members doing work in the party for pretty much the entire duration, except at the very beginning, were women. And also the kind of we can maybe return to this idea, but one of the other things that's interesting in terms of organizational form is the link between the kind of the way that they created a party organization that was kind of modeled. Andrew alluded to this, but modeled on democratic centralism and like other kind of democratic centralist parties, but it wasn't linked to Moscow, and it was kind of. I mean, this might be a slightly controversial way to frame it, but I would sort of say one of the things I'm interested in where my research is going is the link between the Panthers as a kind of organization and also as a social movement, and the difference. And one of the things that gets lost I'm doing this all, and I'm going to undermine myself in a moment, because one of the things that gets lost when you just kind of go through the major events is the way that the Panthers kind of spread very quickly as almost like it was very much at the time rapid growth, and so not really, which led to some problems with repression and with infiltration from the FBI and others, which we'll talk about a little bit, but we could do a whole 3 hours just on repression. So let me just kind of go through. I'll just read a couple pages from this document just to give you the timeline, and then I'll turn it back to Andrew to kind of give some broad context. So the party, the Black Panther Party, originally was called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They dropped the for Self-Defense part shortly after. It was co-founded in October 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, who knew each other in student movements in the Bay Area at the time. So after several months of local actions in Oakland, including armed patrol and confrontation against the police, one of the first kind of signal moments of the Panthers was they provided an armed security escort for Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz, when she visited the Bay Area in February 1967. So 5 months or so after their founding. In April of 1967, the party protested and organized the community around the police shooting of Denzel Dowell in North Richmond, California. So one of the main sort of impetuses in the very early part of the party was kind of responding to basically like extrajudicial and police killings of young black men in urban communities, especially, which if you pay attention to United States politics, is still kind of an issue of great importance now. So and then so that was in April. They organized the community, and the earliest instances of their own newspaper were kind of rallying support to call attention to this police shooting. And then on May 2nd, about 30 Panthers who were again armed with weapons entered the California Capitol building in Sacramento in order to protest a bill that was introduced. Essentially, the bill was introduced to ban their own practice of patrolling the police with guns. So they would follow the police who were harassing people, and they were within the legal right to do it. I'll talk about this again a little bit later. But basically, the California Senate introduced a bill pretty much specifically to target them. And so to protest this bill, they went to the Capitol and went into the state Capitol with guns, which was kind of a major catalyst in terms of reaching nationwide notoriety. So you had these armed and militant looking. You probably saw the pictures and you've seen pictures maybe before of, but these kind of armed, military looking black men entering into the state Capitol building with guns to sort of assert their right to have them. And there was a fairly decent press event. They interestingly almost crossed paths with Ronald Reagan, who was at the time the governor of California, who would later become one of the worst presidents. Which is quite an accomplishment given the competition. So because that was in May, and kind of I'll say this a little bit later, but this is kind of the period I'm very interested in what I'll present about strategy, is kind of the emergence of strategy over this period of 7 to 8 months, and how to conceptualize strategy without linking it to a specific moment in time. But I'll come back to that point. So on October 28th, later that year, there was a shooting incident after a traffic stop, which left Oakland police officer John Fry dead, and Huey Newton, who was, the cops had pulled over Huey Newton, he was severely wounded, and so was another second officer. Newton was charged with killing the officer. There are conflicting reports about what happened on that night, but Newton, would be jailed, and this would kick off what would be a major event, not just for the Panthers, but in U.S. politics. In the late 60s, the Free Huey movement. So there was a kind of movement around releasing Newton. And during these months, when this happened, the party would start to experiment with alliances, specifically with the Peace and Freedom Party in California, and then later, I don't know if Andrew will talk a little bit about this, but later a sort of ill-fated short-term relationship with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was one of the major civil rights and Black Power groups in the 1960s. So just moving ahead, only 5 months after Newton's arrest, and just 2 days after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Panthers Eldridge Cleaver, who was kind of the third in command of the Panthers at the time. Newton and Seal were the two founders, and then Cleaver had gained notoriety in prison and was kind of known for his writing, and they recruited him to join the Panthers. So Cleaver and a 17-year-old Panther named Bobby Houghton were involved in a police shootout, and Hutton was killed he had no shirt on and was surrendering himself to the police, but was killed by the police, and Cleaver was arrested. And so right around this time, Newton was convicted for manslaughter in his trial that I was just mentioning a moment ago, and Cleaver, under the idea that he wouldn't receive a fair trial in the United States, fled to Cuba. And then eventually, I don't know if you'll talk about this either, but the relations between U.S. Black Power activists and the Cuban Revolution is a quite complicated one, because Cuba's internal politics in terms of race were quite complicated, and basically Cleaver didn't get along. This is a whole other topic in itself, but Castro kind of sent Cleaver packing, basically, and he ended up in Algeria. Okay. So early the following year, in 1969, the party had to kind of undertake the beginning of an internal purge because many members were either undisciplined and kind of looking to join the party not for its principles as outlined in its program and in its teachings, but just sort of under the auspices of to do criminal acts. So this illusion that Andrew mentioned, it doesn't have no basis in reality, but there's a kind of conflation between when the massive growth was taking place. There were, essentially criminal elements joining the organization, which were distinct from the kind of vision that the organization laid out. So around this same time in early 1969, there was a conflict over the Black Studies Department at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, between the LA chapter of the Panthers and then a cultural nationalist organization called US, led by Ron Karenga, which resulted in the shooting deaths of two very important Panthers in LA, Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, which was likely at the hands of this other organization. It's also contested. It's not exactly known for sure. Also, Andrew's going to talk about this. In January of 1969 is when the Panthers began. So we're only a year and a half out of their founding. January 1969, the Panthers began their community survival programs in earnest. The most famous one was the Free Breakfast for Children. Maybe you've seen some indication of this one. In April of 1969, 21 members of the New York chapter were arrested on what the prosecutors alleged was a plot to carry out a series of bombings. And then in early May, a Panther named Alex... So in early May, and at this point, Newton is in jail and Cleaver is in Algeria. So Bobby Seale, who was the other co-founder, is the ranking leader of the party. I think Andrew's going to talk about this in a moment. He had also found himself under a legal spotlight because of his actions at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, which is a pretty famous moment in national politics. So he was already sort of under suspicion for this. There was a Panther who was tortured and murdered outside of New Haven, Connecticut, which the police were falsely orchestrating as a directive from the party and from Bobby Seale. And I guess, so we have a little bit of a kind of, I'll skip it. We can talk about it later if people have questions about the repression. But this is a kind of instance which gives you some indication of, so the extent to which they were being surveilled. The police knew that that this other Panther had been bringing this young, so Alex Rackley, who was the guy who was tortured and killed, as being accused of being an informant. The police knew that the torturing and the killing was going on at the time, and they didn't intervene to stop it. And then they later tried to falsely suggest that it was Seale that gave the order to, because of this purge that was going on in the party. So that gives you some indication of the repression. Let's see here. Then the program, the name under which all of these security umbrellas fall is called COINTELPRO, from the FBI counterintelligence program. So throughout 1969, basically, there was increasing tensions between the party and the repercussions of the infiltration. So not just the state repression, but also the kind of suspicion that it cultivated inside the organization, which in November culminated in what was the assassination of Fred Hampton, who was one of the youngest Panthers, one of the youngest national leaders in the Panthers. He was 19 when he was 19 or 20 when he was killed. Okay, so kind of wrapping up this timeline. Let's see. Newton was released from prison in May of 1970, but very quickly there were sort of tensions that emerged between him and Eldridge Cleaver, who was still in exile. And these kind of boiled over in early 1971, where Newton, at the time, was under a lot of pressure. He eventually developed a drug habit, which would kind of plague him for the last several years of his life. But effectively, the kind of quick version of what happened is Newton expelled a key ally of Cleaver named Geronimo Pratt, who in January of 71, who Geronimo Pratt was had served in Vietnam, and he was of major importance in the Los Angeles chapter. And he was another person who, was under as they all was under constant surveillance. He was falsely accused of murdering someone in Los Angeles when the FBI knew that he was in Oakland, and he was partly was convicted because the FBI had a paid informant who never said that they were an informant who testified against him, but also partly he had no support from the party because Newton had expelled him. And so then after this, Newton basically had a live link-up. I've never seen the video of it, but it's like, Eldridge Cleaver was calling in from Algeria so that they could talk about the party, and they had a massive fight on the air. And then Newton, after this, expelled Cleaver and all of his allies from the party. And this would be sort of a major... this kind of, what gets called in the literature, the split between Newton and Cleaver, would be a kind of catalyst for a sequence of violence between the different factions in the party and sympathizers with both sides. So then finally in early 1972, Newton ordered the remaining Black Panther membership to move to Oakland. So they officially closed chapters nationwide as the party was attempting to get local power in the elections in Oakland. Okay, so that's a kind of quick version, or maybe not so quick version of the kind of major events, but just to give you some picture, all of that is just in the span of, a little over 5 years, and that's just the highlights. So I think Andrew will mention a little bit about historical context, and then maybe we'll see if people have questions, and we can turn to our own research a little bit more directly, but just to give you some sense for the scholarship. And I have it can maybe distribute this afterwards, but I have a little section on literature on the Panthers and kind of like some books that would be a starting point if you want to dig further into. One of them is Robin Spencer's book, but we can talk about that in the questions. So I'll turn it to Andrew for a little bit of U.S. historical context, and then we'll talk about our own research.
Great. So I just want to lay out a couple factors that I think are important to keep in mind around the Panthers. Dave's already alluded to quite a few of them, but I think that these are important so that we don't simply think of the party as emerging in any sort of vacuum, right? Like all good historical materialist analysis, we would like to investigate some of the changing conditions around them as well. So one is the transformation in black labor in the 1950s. Before World War II, there were waves of out-migration from the South before this, but before World War II, the African-American population in the United States was overwhelmingly concentrated in the South, right? The vestiges of slavery, the continuation through sharecropping, the majority of black workers in the United States were engaged in agricultural labor. During the war and shortly after, there's incredibly rapid mechanization of agriculture in the United States, which means displacing a lot of the labor from the former plantations of the U.S. South, especially. So this meant that black workers were moving north in droves. So this is often referred to as the Great Migration. It's one of the largest migrations that we can see, at least in the context of the United States, in its short history. So you have a growing concentration of African Americans in northern cities, right? Of course, black workers were still often excluded from unions and leadership positions in these industrial sectors, but you have this kind of wide-scale transformation. And Oakland was one of the sites where this was taking place. During the Second World War, Oakland drew black Americans in great numbers, They had shipbuilding and defense industries being located, on a port. Also on the West Coast, they were involved in the Pacific Theater, right? They were a major kind of waypoint for supplies and troops heading west, as well as Long Beach. But the port of Oakland was a major hub for that. So you have Black Americans arriving to Oakland in droves in the 40s, right? But the post-war demobilization, right, changed what American capitalism looked like, changed what the industries looked like. And of course, also you have the return of hundreds of thousands of white workers to these industries, displacing the black workers who may have gotten a toehold. So this is the sort of context of Black Oakland in the 50s. You have a population density that's much increased over the last couple of decades. You have a working class community that has experienced a period of, industrial employment, but now you're seeing a receding of that kind of that status, of that kind of stable, what looked like stable industrial employment at the time. Okay, so and this is the context in which both Bobby Seale and Huey Newton's families moved to Oakland, right? So they're the children of migrant workers in that sense, coming up from the South. Okay, so that's sort of some of the political economic context of Oakland, like the context in which the party emerges. But another thing, of course, to remember is McCarthyism decimating the U.S. left in the 1950s, right? And this especially harmed black organizations and black members of non-specifically black organizations. So you have a lot of African Americans who had been affiliated with the U.S. Communist Party, who are kind of rooted out of the AFL-CIO, right, the major trade union confederation. You have many people who were schooled in, for example, the Highlander Center in Tennessee, which is kind of like a movement educational center that nurtured many of the early leaders in the civil rights movement, both those that were famous as well as those who didn't attract as much kind of mainstream attention, people like L. Baker. You have many of these people also being red-baited out of organizations, right? And we see Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King, right? A sort of paragon of the so-called respectable civil rights movement, of course, was dogged by associations of being a communist throughout the 1950s, right? So it's important to keep in mind that the Panthers emerge, obviously, a bit later than all this, but the 1950s mark this sort of, it's not a clean break between the old left and the new left, but there is something of a sort of void, right? There's something of a decimation. It's not just a void because it didn't just simply happen passively, it was actively carried out, but it's important to kind of take recognition of this kind of fracture in the 50s. Okay, but by the end of the 1950s, there's a bit of a change of the situation changes. You have a labor strike wave in 1959. I know in Italy, you have your own kind of history of the economic miracle in the post-war era, right, which was ultimately sort of thrown into confusion, right, in the early 1960s, striking workers at Fiat and other places, kind of giving a lie to this idea of balanced development, right, that is kind of lifting all boats. So in the U.S., we have something similar at the end of the 50s. It also times with a sharp economic recession. There's actually one in 1958 and then again in 60, 61. So, the 50s, I don't know if this image travels, but in the U.S. it's still very popular to view the 50s as a sort of peaceful, prosperous time of harmonized growth, right? First of all, the civil rights movement gives lie to that immediately. But also by the end of the decade, even white workers were kind of in tumult as well. Okay, and then the last thing to keep in mind is, as Dave mentioned, the Cuban Revolution of 1959, just off the shore, southern shores of Florida, very on the doorstep of the United States. This notion of a sort of third worldist kind of internationalist, Marxist-Leninist specter. Is haunting the U.S. government in some ways, right? We can talk about how it was used as a specter a bit more, but it also played a major role in both sort of inspiring the imagination of Black Americans who had either been involved in socialist or communist organizations before or not. People like Robert F. Williams, who pioneered armed self-defense in the U.S. South, in the 1950s and then had to flee to Cuba. He found, a safe space there where he launched a radio program that was very influential in kind of nurturing a lot of the early Black Power activists. So Cuba is a small country, but I think it plays a major role in kind of understanding the 60s in the U.S. But of course, one of the most major things that we haven't really talked about at length, and we won't get to necessarily, is the civil rights movement and Black Power movements more broadly, right? So the Panthers don't emerge from a vacuum of social movement activity around race in the United States, of course. But it must be emphasized, these were working class and poor people's movements. The civil rights movement and Black Power movement were working class and poor people's movements, even if they had certain representatives of kind of the upper echelons, highly educated pastors and people with PhDs as the so-called leaders of the movement. These were mass struggles that engaged hundreds of thousands of people in mobilizations across the country. And this was also in the 1950s. Some of these lead to legislation, right? Might be familiar with the federal government's mandate to desegregate schools in the U.S. South. Famous case is the Little Rock Nine, where 9 young African American children were, court ordered to be able to enter an all-white school in Arkansas. And you can see film of this online. There's a massive, crowd that was outside the school waiting to keep them out, right? To protest their inclusion in the school. And what this also led to was frictions between the states and the federal government. So you have federal troops sent to protect the integration of formerly all-white schools, and you have local police, right, or state police also, who are on the other side of things. So you have these frictions, right? Perhaps even you could call it a crisis in the state at this time, which is important to keep in mind. Okay, so as we get into the 1960s, I'm skipping a lot of things here. Forgive me. We also have the beginning of kind of a long season of riots in the United States, of uprisings, of rebellions in the streets, in cities, but not only, in the North especially, but not only. So in 1963, actually, one of the first of this sort of cycle, there's a major riot in Birmingham, Alabama, right, which is one of the cradles of the civil rights movement. The so-called nonviolent and peaceful civil rights movement was also one of the sites where insurgency kind of took a different form. So you have a series of riots in 1964, including one in East Harlem and in Philadelphia. And then in 1965, one that's very important to know in the context of the Panthers was in Watts, which is sort of a section of Los Angeles. And the Watts riots were on a scale that had not been seen in some of those previous ones. The Watts riot gave the federal government, the local government in California, a very serious scare in the sense of whether this kind of, the fragile kind of harmony that had emerged in the 1950s and early 1960s U.S. state relationships with its populations, if that could hold, right? Or if something like wide-scale revolt could be on the horizon. Okay, so the last thing I just want to say, and I'll come back to it after I pass it to Dave, is that in the context of all of this, in 1964, you have beginnings of what's called the War on Poverty, which was under President Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president after John F. Kennedy was killed. Some of this started under Kennedy, certainly, and there were architects and sort of advisors who straddled both of those presidencies. But in 1964, basically, the U.S. federal government launches the largest series of federal welfare initiatives that it had done since the New Deal in the 1930s. In part, we need to see this as a response to the civil rights movement, the labor struggles of the late 1950s, the rioting and uprisings throughout the early 60s. We can't separate these things from one another. And I'll return to why this is important, because some criticisms of the Panthers like to dwell on the fact that the Panthers, the founders of the Panthers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, had previously worked in offices that were funded by these federal dollars for these war on poverty efforts. So I want to frame it with all that insurgency leading up to it, so that we can understand a bit more how the relationship between the emergence of social movements and state programs unfolds in the case of the Panthers later in the 60s. So now I think, let's see, with regard to time, do you want to make some remarks about the literature?
I'll say one, maybe two things fast on the literature, and then we can see if anyone has questions or if we want to take a small break. Basically, in recent 10, 15 years, there's been an upsurge in kind of critical attention on the Panthers by scholars. And part of this is due to the fact that, as with movements of a similar time, enough time has passed where a younger generation of people didn't live through the moment and are able to kind of look back at it with a scholarly eye. So there's a kind of, since 2005, 2006, there's a kind of upsurge in kind of historical and sociological work. Of course, from the time period, there's a substantial amount of writing. I'll talk a little bit in my talk in a moment about some of Huey Newton's earliest writings, so that Huey Newton writings are available. Bobby Seale wrote a book at the time that was very widely sold, as well as Eldridge Cleaver was a famous writer before he entered into the Panthers. There's writings from other New Left movements at the time around the Panthers. One of the major things to mention, I didn't mention it really too much when I was going through the timeline, but the newspaper was one of the central hubs of activities for the Panthers throughout their period of time. So it kind of started as a more or less like a newsletter, very short, and then within a year it became a full-fledged newspaper. And between 68 and 71, it had for periods of time it was the most widely circulated newspaper among black readers in the U.S. And so just to give you some numbers, around 300,000 copies per week. I think it was weekly. At one point it switched. It wasn't quite, but during this time it was a weekly newspaper. There were distribution centers, the major one in San Francisco, and then all throughout the country. So in terms of print culture, also included not just sort of writings about the Panthers and about what was going on in the chapters, but it had reportings from other revolutionary movements and situations around the world. You had lots of art in the newspaper, so Emory Douglas and Teoria Lewis, who were kind of undertaking a lot of the distinctive, especially Douglas, but also Lewis, very distinctive style of art was in the newspapers and was widely disseminated among working class people. The other two things to maybe note: the popular press on the Panthers is mostly bad. I mean, no disrespect to the popular press, but it's usually not so good on left-wing movements and struggles. In the early 1990s, two Panthers, so Elaine Brown, who I mentioned, was one of the leaders of the Panthers, and then David Hilliard, who was one of the other earliest members of the Panthers. They both released memoirs about their time in the Panthers, and this was partly because Newton was killed in the late 1980s. So they released these memoirs, and then there was this a conservative journalist named Hugh Pearson released this book that's called Shadow of a Panther, which basically says that there's two Huey Newtons. There's the kind of idealistic community leader, and then the petty criminal. And he kind of, it's this kind of melodramatic, psychological story that doesn't, but this is kind of one of the sort of big, and in part in response to this, both people from the movements and also scholars of other movements began to focus more attention to create a better kind of understanding, in part because this book was a kind of popular audience book. He was a journalist. And so the other thing to mention, there's lots of more recent memoirs from members. I just wanted to mention this one. I'm just finishing reading it. It's called Solitary. I can send it around. It's a Panther who became a Panther in prison, Albert Woodfox. He became a Panther in one of the worst prisons in the United States called Angola in Louisiana. and he and two others, Herman Bell and Robert King, are kind of known for being some of the prisoners worldwide who were put in solitary confinement for more or less 30 years. There's recent lots of discussions about the ethics of solitary confinement. He was also set up for a killing that he didn't do, and they kind of like many people of the movement who weren't just killed by the police. They were kind of many Black Power advocates, and not just in the Panthers, but especially in the Panthers, were kind of sent into prisons and thrown away. The key, and many of them, they kept working even after the dissolution of the chapters. There was a kind of interesting, disparity between kind of what was going on inside prisons and also outside prisons. That's a whole other discussion about sort of prison organizing and the history of prisons in the U.S. But the Panthers are kind of part of that as well. In part, George Jackson, who was a kind of famous prison writer at the time, was a Panther, and he was killed.